And welcome to this breakout session, which forms part of the 11th Annual Analysys Mason Telecoms Summit. My name is David McElroy, and I work as part of Analysys Mason's online events team. Now, you may have already watched some other sessions leading up to this one. However, I just wanted to remind you of a few points that will make sure you get the most out of this and all of our other summit presentations. Firstly, remember that all sessions are available on demand, meaning that you can access them in an order and at a time and a date that suits you. We have a selection of keynote and breakout sessions for you to choose from, and you can access all of them via the event homepage. Once you have entered your chosen presentation, you'll have the ability to connect with and contact our presenters. You'll be able to access useful resources and submit questions. Please use the console widgets that you can see in front of you to do all of those things. Now, as these sessions are available on demand, our presenters will pick up your questions and they will respond to you via email in the coming days. Once the presentation has ended, you can click the event homepage to return and select another session. Now, in that note, I'll simply hand over to our presenters. On this session, we have Research Director for Fibre Networks, Rupert Wood, and we have Principal Analyst, Stephen Wilson. So Stephen's going to kick off the session. So I'll hand over to you, Stephen, whenever you're ready. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, David. Yes, my name is Stephen Wilson. So I'm a principal analyst in the research team, the consumer team at Analysys Mason. I'm joined by my colleague Rupert Wood, research director for Fibre Networks. And today we're going to talk about monetizing new FTTP networks. So my portion of the presentation will concentrate on the retail side of things, and Rupert will focus on the wholesale side of things. So firstly, a slide to set the scene here. So what we're seeing is huge increases in FTTP investment, and this will intensify retail and wholesale competition. So what we show in the chart, we show the number of premises passed in Europe with fibre to the premises. We note throughout the forecast period up to 2026, strong growth in coverage for both incumbents and altnets, some incumbent carve-outs as well, but a very significant growth in the number of premises passed, total unique premises passed, which is the dotted blue line. What this means is this huge amount of investment coming from incumbents and altnets is there will be a significant amount of overbuild between competing fibre networks, so often between the fibre network of the incumbent and a fibre network of an altnet, and you can see that ratio sort of end 2026 will be above 1.2. So all this really signifies a very intense competitive environment. So this high level of overbuild, lots of fibre deployed. So in this sort of context, it's very important for retail FTTP operators to carefully design their tariffs and retail packages. So that's what we talk about in this next slide. So again, this is here we're referring to Europe. So we believe fibre operators in Europe have significant room to increase their entry-level retail FTTP speeds. So what we see in the chart, this is taken from our fibre pricing tracker. It's data from the third quarter of 2021. And it shows, divided by incumbent FTTP, alternative operator FTTP, and cable, the proportion of entry-level tariffs at different speeds. So what we see for incumbent FTTP and alternative operator FTTP is that more or less sort of 50% of entry-level offers are with speeds of 100 megabits per second and below. Now that number is somewhat higher for cable operators. It's around 70% of entry-level offers for cable are at 100 megabits per second and below. But what we believe here is that for both incumbents and alternative fibre operators, there is significant room to increase those entry-level speeds. And I think there's a number of important reasons to do that. So firstly, it's to put pressure on cable. So we see there is already a lead for fibre operators in terms of entry-level speeds, but we think there is potential for more there. To squeeze cable, which may be challenged in terms of the costs perhaps of DOCSIS 4 upgrades or upgrades to full fibre. So that's one reason. What we also see generally is that offering sort of lower entry-level speeds, certainly of less than 100 megabits per second, you're artificially constraining the value of taking a fiber connection. And our sense is that there is always value to consumers from offering higher speeds. So, for instance, simply in terms of the argument for instant gratification with rapid, instantaneous, really, downloads of very large files. Now, at the same time, we do think that there is scope to increase upload speeds as well, in light of what's happened with the pandemic and the growth in home working. And also higher speeds will tend to go hand in hand with lower latencies, and lower latency is certainly something that could deliver benefits with some different applications as well. So all those reasons are important, to which we can add the fact that we're seeing interest in further advancements in PON technologies, so now talking about 25 and 50 gig capacities. And that's important because it gives a very long runway for fiber operators to keep increasing their speeds. So one could offer much higher entry-level speeds today, but still be secure in the knowledge that over time you could keep migrating those subscribers to higher speeds because of this very long runway that exists. So in our next slide, we talk about all the different services that fiber operators could layer on top of their fiber networks in this very competitive retail environment. And what we talk about here is that how home Wi-Fi optimization is essential for delivering on the promise of gigabit fiber. So here we're talking about really cloud-managed home Wi-Fi. So doing things like changing the Wi-Fi channel that is being used by different devices in the home after performing some analysis in the cloud. And clearly this is very closely linked to FTTP connectivity. And our sense is that there is very little logic in spending hundreds of dollars per premises passed in rolling out fiber, but then not spending, then being let down by a poor quality in-home Wi-Fi experience, which undermines those investments. And that's particularly so when we consider that the costs of cloud-managed Wi-Fi are of the order of sort of $1 to $2 per subscriber per year. So very low compared to the capex required for rolling out fiber. And not only that, these costs associated with cloud-managed Wi-Fi also bring about cost-saving opportunities. For instance, in terms of reduced number of call center calls or lower duration of call center calls. So it's a very powerful and persuasive argument for investing in cloud-managed home Wi-Fi. Now, there are some disadvantages. Some features may be unnecessary. There are things that you can do on device in terms of optimizing the Wi-Fi connection, things that you can do in real time. But we still think that using the cloud for longer term analysis can deliver some important benefits. Now, another area that could be useful in differentiating in a competitive retail environment is in terms of parental controls and device identification. So here we're referring to things like the ability to switch on and off Wi-Fi connectivity on different devices at different times of the day, having assigned those devices to different people within the home. Also parental controls in terms of being able to block inappropriate content and so on. And the advantages here are that typically I think there is a solid interest amongst subscribers in this kind of service. It might be used on a frequent basis by sort of 20 to 30% of subscribers. And the costs of such services to the operators are generally pretty low as well. So it's of the order of sort of perhaps $1 to $2 dollars per US dollars per subscriber per year. So reasonable cost. I think the challenges here are in terms of probably limited or lower differentiation than some of the other services. And that's simply because these things have already been pretty widely deployed by operators. Although much of the value is in terms of how operators can integrate them, for instance, within their own apps. And there may also be supplier resistance, for example, to purchasing only this functionality when a supplier may also offer other services. And such other services actually may include what we talk about here, which is connected home cybersecurity. And we believe that is a good fit for fiber to the premises operators. So what is it, connected home cybersecurity? This is rather than providing cybersecurity on an endpoint basis with software downloaded onto the endpoint devices. This is typically providing network level security where that cybersecurity is included within the home router. So we see a number of advantages here. There's certainly a growing need for this kind of thing. There's clearly a growth in the number of connected devices, which we often hear about, but also I think the pandemic is important here. Trends towards greater home working are important and drive an increased awareness of the need for cybersecurity. In addition, we think operators may be well placed here as trusted providers of such solutions, particularly when compared against some of the OTT players like Amazon Eero that are also present in the connected home cybersecurity space. Again, costs to the operator are pretty reasonable. So it's sort of the order of USD $2 plus per subscriber per year. And we do, as we'll talk about later, we do think these kind of services can be monetized. Now, the disadvantages here might be in terms of the need for solutions that work inside and outside the home. So it may be considered insufficient by consumers to have protection just for their home network. There may be a desire to see the devices protected outside the home as well. And I think there's also some challenges in terms of limited customer understanding of the product and limited awareness so far, but I'm sure that will grow over time. Now, another interesting service, which again we think is promising, is home Wi-Fi motion detection. So this is where the devices within your home are turned into motion sensors, Wi-Fi connected devices. And this typically might have applications around elderly care, so checking for movement of elderly citizens. It might be for home security type applications if there's unexpected movement within the home. So a number of different applications there. And again, it's a sort of low cost to the operator along the lines of the costs of some of these other services. So whilst this is a promising service, there are some challenges here. So the number of active users may be quite low simply because this service is often offered by operators as an opt-in service where consumers must actively agree to take the service. There's also some challenges in terms of non-universal chipset support, but this is changing as more chipset suppliers support the technology with their newer chipsets. You might say generally this is so far more of a feature than an actual service so far, but again, we take a positive view of the value of these different services for FTTP operators operating in competitive retail environments. Now here, here again we talk about and crystallize some of the benefits of offering these kind of value-added services. And our general sense is that selling value-added services separately risks minimizing the benefits to operators. So what we see in the chart, this is Comcast in the US, it's broadband ARPU from 4Q 2017 to 2Q 2021. And what we see is that Comcast has been hugely successful in increasing ARPU, thanks in part to value-added services in the CPE. So you can see there have been periodic price rises in the monthly rental fee that Comcast charges, and those the cadence of those price increases is much increased since Comcast focused on these kind of Wi-Fi value-added services starting from mid-2017. Whilst at the same time as growing its ARPU, Comcast has also enjoyed 14 quarters of falling churn and an improved share of market net additions. So this really speaks to the power of offering these kind of services in competitive retail markets. What we also think is that selling value-added services separately may result in limited take-up, so perhaps 10 to 20% of customers, and therefore there will be lower ARPU and revenue gains. And really, to summarize, with FTTP overbuild and the urgent need for FTTP return on investment, really this strengthens the case for offering these kind of services associated with home Wi-Fi to as many subscribers as possible, rather than selling them separately. Now, in this slide, we talk about, well, we've talked about the power of these value-added services associated with home Wi-Fi, but even with these, we still think that smaller FTTP players are exposed to FMC bundles, and this increases the need for wholesale. So fixed mobile convergence bundles can put pressure on smaller standalone FTTP providers. So this is something we forecast, and in the chart on the left side, this is FMC share of fixed broadband across many different markets. And we can see in most markets by 2025, FMC will be a significant proportion of fixed broadband connections, and the number will be growing in most markets over time as well. So this potentially poses some challenges for smaller FTTP entrants without mobile businesses. At the same time, new FTTP entrants theoretically are at a disadvantage, or are at a disadvantage in procuring content, but this will matter less as operator video service penetration stagnates. Now, overall, we do think there are service platforms of different kinds that support multiple smaller ISPs with services are worth considering. So, for instance, in the services associated with home Wi-Fi, Plume is one of the companies that can bundle these different services together and cater for smaller players. There are also other models like Altibox in Norway, developing a single brand to operate over networks with different ownership structures, and also to operate and procure video content and get economies of scale across multiple smaller providers. But at the same time, what we do also think is that all players can consider offering wholesale access to increase FTTP network utilization. Now, this is something that I will hand over to my colleague Rupert to talk about.
Thank you, Stephen. So I'll be picking up on your last point about fixed mobile retail bundling and the pressure that places on standalone vertically integrated FTTP infrastructure providers. So retail provision, sort of broadly on the left here, splits along different axes from infrastructure provision, which is on the right. And as Stephen pointed out, consumers often want more than simple high-speed internet access. This customer segmentation happens, generally speaking, the retail customer segmentation, generally speaking, at a national level, while infrastructure provision splits up along, pretty geographical lines. And there you go. They don't match. So, for example, as Stephen said, Household X will resist buying a new FTTP service because they have cheap or even free mobile contracts thrown in with their current, what might be a copper-based provider. Or Household Y will resist the delights of FTTP because they like the content deal from their cable co. And we see this pressure to start wholesaling in the business plans of new infrastructure providers. Some of course, are wholesale only from the outset, but we also see built into the long-term planning of an increasing number of vertically integrated players, a recognition that, after a period of picking off the low-hanging retail fruit, they will have to start wholesaling as well, perhaps switching to a sort of increasingly familiar wholesale plus anchor tenancy model. And in fact, we're aware of some that even factor in a decline in their own retail utilization of the network they've built. So if the level of fiber build and wholesale is creeping up, and we should really emphasize this, that cable cos are likely to join in with this too. We tend to think of cable cos as sort of part of this market and maybe not quite part of this market. But if that level of fiber overbuild is creeping up, then as an infrastructure provider, you have to be good at wholesale. So what do whole buyers actually want from their suppliers? Is it access to ducts and poles? Is it access to unlit fiber? Is it bitstream services like VULA or some regionally aggregated variant? Is it do they want something even more, a programmable network interface? Do they want rock bottom prices or service agility? What do they value more? And I think it depends, currently at least, on their scale. And it depends still, though I would argue to a dwindling extent, on the approach the incumbent operator has been obliged or permitted to take by regulation. However, as more and more new FTTP infrastructure players enter the market, including, as I said, those cable cos, the wholesale market is getting more complex and, above all else, actually more commercially driven. So one answer to that question, what do they want, is simply to quantify what whole buyers are actually buying. And this slide is a simplified view of the share of lines with a wholesale input across all of fixed broadband in the largest 5 economies in Europe. I've split it into, for simplification purposes, I've split it into copper and fiber, and into passive, that's layer 1, and active, that's layer 2 and layer 3 access. So what are the trends? Well, we can identify a few. First, wholesale is growing as a proportion of the total. The remainder, the bit above the 50%, is self-supply. Active access on copper is growing, or has grown, because FTTC VULA, virtual unbundled local access, is rapidly replacing physical access to copper, and that's the historical trend that's been going for some time. And FTTP itself, in both forms, wholesale is growing because it's supplanting copper. But at the moment, the larger share of wholesale FTTP is passive access. In other words, fiber unbundling. So why is this? Well, it actually splits up along national lines. It's because in France, that's the way the market has been set up. It's been structured in that way to offer layer 1, to be based on layer 1. And because in Italy, the early impetus in FTTP came from a national provider, Open Fiber, whose network infrastructure was set up from the outset to accommodate large-scale fiber unbundling. Now, fiber unbundling is not yet, I emphasize, common in the UK or Germany, and the additional cost and effort to accommodate layer 1 tenants, if the original infrastructure was not set up for multiple tenancy of this kind, is considerable. It's clumsy and kind of quite expensive to do. So perhaps, actual take-up doesn't tell us that much about the potential future. So moving on to the next slide, I'd say wholesalers face a dilemma. This diagram shows an indicative view of revenue and long-term margins for 3 different business models, and it's all distilled from conversations we've had with infrastructure providers. Now, vertically integrated retail only, which I show on the left, layer 1 passive access is on the right. That's fiber unbundling in the green box. And layer 2 active access is in the middle. And the y-axis shows an indicative view, relative view of average revenue per line and of margin. The x-axis shows the sort of utilization of premises passed that they might typically achieve. So the wider the block, the higher the utilization. For the vertically integrated player, utilization depends on the power of the mainstream retail service providers. The layer 1 player on the right might pick up many retail service providers, including the larger ones, but overall utilization will also depend on the level of overbuild it faces. Now, historically speaking, bitstream services, those in the middle in the blue box, if there's a choice, have been less attractive to the larger whole buyers than passive access. if we think about margins, there isn't a simple correlation between lower OPEX and higher margins. Vertically integrated players on the left face high OPEX. Cost of sale and cost of services almost invariably dilute margins. Fiber unbundling on the right may get lower margins, long-term margins, than bitstream because of the market power of the kind of whole buyers that are most likely to take it. You know, you need about a 15% retail market share to play in unbundling, and they have the scale to drive down on price. So really, in an increasingly competitive wholesale market, the trick for wholesalers, if they can pull it off, is to find a set of services that delivers both the higher margins of active and the higher utilization of passive. Many of you will be familiar with the ladder of investment concept, which dominated European thinking for but 2 decades or more. The idea is, or was, that access seekers, the whole buyers, will, as they scale up and seek more autonomy, gradually invest in more and more parts of their own networks, their own transport links, their own actives, even their own fiber cables. Therefore, the wholesale service will become ever simpler and lower value, lower unit value, until the whole superstructure of wholesale has served its historical purpose and withers away. Thus, the whole buyer in this scenario willingly embraces owner economics. And this was clearly true in the copper era. Access seekers nearly always preferred to invest in their own DSLAMs. They used copper unbundling, not bitstream. Now, FTTX threw a spanner into the works. Some countries, however, created frameworks that rested on access to ducts, like France and like Spain and Portugal, and or layer one, like France. But in many markets, typically the late mover markets on FTTP, where there's high capital costs per premises passed, and on the whole, these were markets that tended initially to prioritize FTTC. It was deemed either uneconomic or too technically difficult to follow the passive model. So active models that replicated as far as possible passive access were introduced. This was virtual unbundled local access, or VULA as it's generally called, and was intended to preserve operational autonomy for the access seeker, but on someone else's actives. And that involved climbing back down the investment ladder. So I think we're at a fork in the road in late mover FTTP countries. Either the route more intensive in CapEx, or the route more intensive in OPEX, with perhaps a hybrid form of financial commitment replacing CapEx in property and plants and equipment. It's a moment of great uncertainty, I think. The question is, will competition, commercial forces, as it were, eventually deliver up layer one access in those markets where it's absent? Or can wholesalers do things to make the active access option more attractive? Now, the OPEX intensive active access roadmap has still some way to go, as I'll show in the next slide. Network as a service on FTTP access networks is essentially the digital transformation of wholesale. Software-defined access networks transform the access network into a platform by abstracting network functions and serving them up as software functions. It enables, critically, the partition of network resources, including aggregation and backhaul parts of the network, and other parts of the network, not just the broadband access part of the network. It enables the partition of those network resources into discrete slices. Now, you could serve up application-specific slices, and to be honest, I'm a little skeptical. Perhaps much of this has a little commercial value, has little commercial value, and I think it can seem like wishful telco thinking. And best efforts on an XGS PON network is pretty good, good enough for most. But you can also, and I think this is more important and more realistic, slice the network up among access seekers so that each of them get a virtual slice, and apparently, from their own perspective, autonomy and automation, a high degree of automation. Now, getting CapEx to OpEx substitution is a cherished goal of the wholesale infrastructure provider, and it doesn't always work. And I said, as I said earlier, it runs somewhat counter to the historical trend, which is OpEx to CapEx. For all the grand promises of automation and time to market, all those things that are promised by this setup, by network as a service, most access seekers, virtual network operators, you can call them if you want, what they really want is low total cost of ownership. And historically speaking, CapEx-oriented owner economics has generally delivered them just that. So what is it about this ultra-automated, this network as a service model, this sort of bit stream on steroids? What is it about it that might tip the balance in favor of more active wholesale access? I think there are three reasons. First, and this is worth emphasizing because we haven't said much about it at the moment, end user pull is replacing provider push in FTTP. Demand is good now. Service providers may need more urgently access to FTTP to defend retail market share than to move off into more capital intensive modes of delivering that. And second, it allows other network resources that the infrastructure provider might have, legacy access, copper, whatever, backhaul trunks of the network and so forth, to be brought into the set of resources served up to the VNO. So a mobile operator could, for example, take slices of non-access fixed network resources as well as broadband access. And third, and I think this is where it may have the most impact, particularly in markets like the UK with highly fragmented FTTP ownership, is that the platform principle could encompass a sort of federation of differently owned network resources, a single software wholesale connectivity platform for multiple networks. And this is sort of like a wholesale version of what Stephen mentioned earlier, which is the common retail B2C service platform that's already a model very well established in Norway. But to have a single software wholesale connectivity platform across multiple networks represents a significant avoidance of duplicated CapEx for these regional infrastructure providers. Now, who controls this platform is open. So it's open to question, it's uncertain. It could be a standalone platform play. And that's been played around with in some markets in Sweden, a little bit in the UK, in South Africa, we've seen that. Or it could be one of the altnets or a cable co. But it could also be a way for an incumbent to reassert itself in areas where it's not the first builder and has no appetite to overbuild, as Deutsche Telekom has recently hinted. Given the level of investment and the consequence, and as a consequence, this level of overbuild, and thinking again about cable entering this market, some consolidation is highly likely. And this approach, via a software platform, could be significantly simpler than M&A. Now, I've been mostly talking about Europe. Europe is a uniquely regulated region. But one of the points I've been making is that it is increasingly commercial pressures that are shaping wholesale in Europe. So what about those commercial pressures elsewhere? Let's look a little further afield, the Americas. Now, the Latin American market is already breaking up along European lines. We see plenty of examples of carve-outs of FTTP infrastructure, new co-investors, new netcos, and interestingly, sometimes coming from different parts of the telecoms ecosystem from anything in Europe. So we see towercos getting involved in FTTP infrastructure in Latin America. Now, what about the really big market, the USA? Well, we see that historically the wholesale sector in broadband has not been particularly dynamic in the USA. It's not been particularly large. But we see three factors that could fuel a much larger wholesale sector. First, although it's at an earlier stage than in Europe, there's the rise of fixed mobile bundling. Second, two American mobile operators, Verizon and T-Mobile, couch fixed mobile bundling as fixed wireless access plus mobile bundling. It's, in other words, everything on the 5G network. This, and this is a very different story, which I won't go into here, strikes us as a mistake, a waste of very pricey C-band spectrum and potentially very damaging to mobile service provision. 5G fixed wireless access is surely a stopgap. And third, telco fixed infrastructure in the USA has in fact always been geographically fragmented. And it's that geographical fragmentation that we saw that's actually driving some of the wholesale thinking in Europe. Now, these three factors create opportunities for wholesale service provision by FTTP investors. Yes, certainly AT&T, which is, has a renewed impetus in rolling out more fiber, but also the tier 2 ILECs that again have a renewed impetus to roll out fiber, and new altnets. And as with Europe, that should mean further external investment opportunities. So just a concluding slide here. So I'll recap for Stephen. For retail fiber to the premise operators, a focus on Wi-Fi connectivity, in particular using cloud management, and services associated with home Wi-Fi, such as connected home cybersecurity, will all yield benefits. Second, virtualizing the wholesaler service provider interface will be an effective means to preserve value and margin on fiber investment while responding to the rapidly increasing demand for FTTP and for converged services that involve FTTP. And third, wholesale connectivity platforms may be the best way for geographically fragmented alternative operators to consolidate. And they're also a way for incumbent players to maintain market relevance over whole geographies. So that concludes the presentation. Thank you very much for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the summit.